I was 17 years of age. It was my baptism day. I don't know why I'd waited till 17 for baptism, because I'd grown up in a church. But it was at the age of 16 that I had an encounter with Jesus Christ at a concert in Liverpool with Graham Kendrick and Eric Delve speaking. He spoke about the agony that Jesus went through, and I responded to the gospel that was preached that night. I went home. I was still just about in church. I went home, told my youth pastor that I'd had a very emotional encounter last night with Jesus, that I really had given my heart to him fully. And my youth pastor said to me, "It won't last, lad." Thank you. I said, "Well, I just want to tell everyone about Jesus." And he kind of rolled his eyes. I just wanted to tell everyone I was not ashamed of this gospel. I got up, I'd invited all my friends, BMO and Evo, and other O's that were all there. And they were all there, all my friends, because I couldn't stop talking about Jesus. Everyone I met, I had nicknames ranging from one boy used to call me Jesus, another guy used to call me Billy, short for Billy Graham. I had usual Bible basher, Bible thumper, weirdo. And maybe I made some mistakes in the way I went about witnessing in those times. Graffiti on a toilet door shouldn't be allowed. But I wanted to tell everyone about Jesus. So I invited all my friends. And they're sniggering because the church that I was in for the baptism, we didn't have T-shirts that said, "I have decided." We had long black flowing gowns with lead around the bottom that kept the skirt down as you went up. So I walked in, all my friends are there, all sniggering at me. And I got up and I said something like this: "I have decided to follow Jesus. And today is my public declaration of my faith in him." And then I read a verse from Romans, what is thought to be one of the earliest statements of faith that was probably read at baptisms in Rome. I read this, Romans 10. "If you confess with your mouth Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. For it is with your heart that you believe and are justified, and it's with your mouth that you confess and are saved. As the scriptures say, anyone who trusts in him will never be put to shame." And then I eyeballed every one of them. And I said to them, "And I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it's the power of God for salvation for everyone who believes." And not one of them sniggered then, because they knew something had happened in me that had changed my life. I went into the water. I remember the skirt lifted up because there wasn't enough lead on the bottom. But no one was laughing because they knew this was real. I'm not ashamed of the gospel. And if there's one thing we want from this series in Romans, it's that your confidence, and everyone who's listening, your confidence in this gospel of God that the Apostle Paul calls it there in verse 1, this universal gospel, this eternal gospel, this gospel that is always relevant, this gospel that is sufficient for all humanity, this gospel that is sufficient even for the cosmos. We'll say more about that later. We want you to be confident in this gospel. To be able to not arrogantly, but confidently, with shoulders back, heads up, say, "I am not ashamed of this gospel." Now, the Apostle Paul, of course, didn't start off believing this gospel. This well-educated Pharisee persecuted Christians. He was there holding the coats while others were stoned to death. He was an opposer of this Christian sect. He was not a believer till he had an encounter with Jesus Christ on the road to Damascus, which changed everything. And then from then on, because of the commission that God gave him, he wanted everyone to know that they did not need to be ashamed. This was a life-transforming gospel. And he knew that it was for everyone, both Jew and Gentile, which in this kind of terminology means everyone could be saved through the gospel. And the church at Rome, when he writes to them, had been around for some time. It wasn't a new church, and he hadn't visited them. He had this great desire to visit them, and he wanted them to be united, because what had happened is the Jews had been thrown out of the city for some time. And then when they returned, when they were allowed to, they found the church that they'd left was different than the one they were there before. They were no longer talking about circumcision. They were no longer practicing eating kosher food. There was this difference, and they were struggling to connect again. And the Apostle Paul, this comes all the way through Romans, is trying to encourage them. No, our unity is not in the foods we eat or our ethnicity. Our unity is in Jesus Christ. I'm not ashamed of the gospel. It unites us all. So what's the backstory? Well, we read it, or David Suchet read it for us. It starts off with his name, Paul. Now, if we write a letter, we do it very differently. Our name comes at the end. In the ancient world, the name usually came at the beginning. So I'm writing an email. It always starts with hey or hi or dear. If I'm writing a letter, which is very unusual, dear Auntie Anne, because everyone's got an Auntie Anne, haven't they? You'd say who you're writing to, but not Paul. We know straight away through dictation. We heard it last week. He is writing. It's him who's the author. And it says, we know it was Phoebe, I said that at the beginning, who was delivering it. And she was we don't know much about Phoebe, but if you read Romans 16, you find out that she's called a sister, a deacon, which is the word servants, and a benefactor. This was a great lady. But Paul uses this word when he starts off. He says, Paul, a servant of Jesus Christ. Let's use the proper word. He uses the word slave, doulos. Paul, a slave of Jesus Christ. Now, most of us, all of us, I hope, resist the concept of slavery. Someone else owning another human being shouldn't be allowed. It's vile. And we know history shows the nature, and we can't have enough discuss for that. But here, Paul, who is a free man, he's an educated Jew, he's a citizen of Rome, he's a free man. This free man willingly says, Paul, a slave of Jesus Christ. He has no problem saying he's a slave. There's a beautiful picture in the Old Testament, we can't read it for the sake of time, but of this concept of being a slave, a willing slave. I think it's Exodus 21, and what would happen is if a Jew had been in financial problems, they would often sell themselves into slavery. But they could only serve as a slave for 6 years. In the 7th year, they had to be declared free. What a great concept. But in that 7th year, or after 6 years, if the slave did not want to go free because he loved his or her master, and because his master was so kind and considerate, and they had this relationship, the slave would say, I don't want to go free. Don't set me free. I want to stay here. And they had this practice where they would take a sharp instrument and they would get the ear of the slave and they would put it on the doorpost and they would pierce the ear of the slave. And the slave, by saying this, by the way, wasn't saying, oh, and I'm going to serve you for another 6 or 7 years. The slave was then saying, I never want to be free. I want to serve in this house for the rest of my life. And there was a sign that they walked around with at all times that they were no longer a free man or woman. And the sign was a hole in their ear. There's one of the Psalms where it's prophetically speaking of Jesus, where he says, my ears you have pierced, for I delight to do your will, O God. We used to sing a song, I'm not going to sing it. Well, maybe I will. It just went very simple like this. Pierce my ear, O Lord my God. Take me to your door this day. I will serve no other God. A free man I'll never be. Do you know? Thank you. Do you know the only way you can be free is if you become a slave to Jesus? It's the only way to freedom is become a slave to Jesus. Now, Jesus was himself, he used that word doulos. It's used of him rather in Philippians chapter 2. It says when he took on the form of a servant, it's the word doulos. He became a bond slave. And the Apostle Paul is writing to a community, a church, where 30% of them would have been slaves. And they were not nice slave owners. And so this free man is saying to the slaves, I'm a slave too, but I'm not a slave to any man. I'm a slave to Jesus Christ, my Lord. Here's my question to you. Are you a free slave? I am. I've got a pierced ear. I'm going nowhere else. There is nowhere else to go where you'll find freedom. There is nowhere else that you will go that you will find a master like Jesus. Every other master will destroy you, but not Jesus. Pierce my ear. Take me to your throne this day. In verse 6 here, he says this to them. And you also are among those who are called to belong. It's slave language. It's servant language. You belong to Jesus. He who the Son sets free is free indeed. Now, we know who some of these specific free slaves were. Because if we're able to and jump to the last chapter of Romans 16, Paul actually names, more names are mentioned in this section in Romans chapter 16 of people that he specifically wants to mention in Rome. More names are mentioned here than in all the other epistles that Paul wrote put together. So people say Paul he was austere, he was not very relational. These are beautiful greetings that he brings to different ones who are in Rome. And if you read that chapter, and I encourage you to, there are names that are Latin names, so in other words, from a kind of Roman context. There are Greek names, and there are Jewish names. There are names of slaves, and there are names of owners. There are names of women, and that might not sound in a patriarchal kind of context like this that didn't value women, to name women in the way that he did. Phoebe, a servant, a benefactor, a deacon, someone who is a leader in the church. This was radical stuff. And he writes to them all, chapter 16. And you can feel the warmth of his love, the family kind of language that he uses about them. One he talks about was like my mother. Another to my sister or my brother. It's all this sense of belonging together as free slaves. And then he says this. I was caught by this verse. I'm going to read it to you. 16 verse 16. Greet one another with a holy kiss. Now, fear not. I'm not about to introduce some kind of new method of greeting. Well, why does he say greet one another with a holy kiss? It's because there was an infamous kiss that everyone knew about by this stage that was a very unholy kiss. Who was that? Anyone like to think of an unholy kiss in the Bible? Judas. Judas, who betrayed Jesus with a kiss. This is very cultural, we understand, and all of that, but he's basically saying to them, you guys who are family, you who are brothers and sisters, you who belong to one another, don't be like Judas. Let there be no Judases amongst you. Rather, holy holy kiss. Greet one another. Don't stab one another in the back. Don't harm and pull each. Don't betray each other. Don't be like Judas. Holy kissing only. Now, in our kind of context, it might not be a kiss. Though I have had some friends, church leaders, who when I see them, they give me a kiss on the cheek and it feels holy. Because it's not about the kiss, it's about the motive. You hear that? And when what we tend to do, what do we tend to do? Some of us are huggy. Some of us are. Others of us shake a hand. Others of you might do a kiss. Some of you from other cultures across the globe, it's quite normal to do that. So it's not about what we're doing. What we're saying is find a way to express your familiar, your family relationship.
If you enjoyed this video today, why not give it a like? Furthermore, why not subscribe to our channel as we seek to share the light and love of Jesus into your life?